This video is part one of our introductions to corporations. And we will be, through a series of videos, going over three topics. This first video deals with limited liability. The next video will deal with what you might call limited liability problems. And then the last couple of videos will go through the life of a corporation. In the course of these slides, we'll be using various terms that you'll be learning in this class. Those are on the left two columns here. And then on the right, I'll also be noting various classes for those of you who may be interested in business law and talking about what you would learn in those classes and how they're relevant to the slides. This is Chancey, and we're going to be using Chancey as our entrepreneur. He is the risk taker here in starting a business. Chancey's going to be making widgets, and of course he will be making them in the proverbial garage. At this point, Chancey will be operating what's known as a sole proprietorship. We'll discuss that form of organization later in this course. But for our purposes, what's important here is to know that that sole proprietorship is a business entity, but it is virtually indistinguishable from Chancey himself. That means that his bank account is the proprietorship's bank account and vice versa. His credit card is the sole proprietorship's credit card. His debts are the sole proprietorship's debts and vice versa. So you really have this almost complete unity of interest between Chancey and the sole proprietorship. And what this means, of course, is that if someone sues the business or sues on account of something that happens in connection with the business, either a slip and fall in the driveway or Chancey's proprietorship fails to pay a bill to a creditor, then that creditor or that tort victim will sue Chancey individually. There will be no entity to bypass even. It will be the responsibility of Chancey. And this is one of the important problems that lawyers are able to help their clients solve. And the problem is, of course, that not only will Chancey lose the house, which we'll use as a symbol of his personal assets, he will lose all of his personal assets. And what we want is to essentially separate his personal assets from the assets that those creditors can get, and those are assets of the business. So what we're going to do is we are going to form a limited liability entity. A C corporation, also referred to simply as a corporation, is such a limited liability entity. Another one you may have heard of is the limited liability company. And both of them essentially are designed to give you protection from creditors as to your personal assets. So that means that in your capacity as the owner of the business, you cannot be held personally liable if you have limited liability because you operate your business through a limited liability entity. And the house is up there in the corner, protected from being reached by those creditors. So just to review, let's say you have a trade creditor. That's a term of art, by the way, that would typically refer to the business that's your supplier. For example, if you sell sneakers, that would be Nike. And the trade creditor negotiates with Chancey to buy 50 cases of sneakers. Chancey doesn't pay. And if it's a sole proprietorship, what will happen? Well, Nike will sue on the contract. And before we go any further on that, I just wanted to share with you a kind of understanding of contracts I wish I'd been given before I started law school. Here we think of contracts essentially as the obligations you agreed to, often referred to in economics as private ordering. So you've signed up for these obligations, which is a nice way of distinguishing contracts from torts, which I like to think of as essentially the obligations the society has signed you up for. Society determines that you have certain duties that you cannot negotiate out of or around. And that's a useful way of thinking about the difference between contracts and torts. So let's get back to our contracts case brought by the trade creditor against Chancey with respect to the sole proprietorship. So the trade creditor will, of course, file a complaint. That claim will go after Chancey individually. Chancey will file a motion to dismiss. Maybe Chancey's lawyer is confused and thinks that Chancey has limited liability in his sole proprietorship, but that will not be the case. Now, all of this is to remind you of key courses you may want to think about taking, especially if you're interested in being a litigator in the area of commercial law. But even if you are just a transactional lawyer, it's still important to have context for the transactional advice, the counseling that you provide. And that context is that all of the advice you provide is always going to be provided with an eye to litigation, because it is ultimate litigation that kind of sets the ground rules, that provides that line that you have an eye to, that you do not want to cross, resulting in inefficient liability on the part of your client. So this is the beginning of some of the key courses that you may want to think about taking. I also wanted to emphasize that the interviewing and negotiations aspects are extremely important to a transactional lawyer. Transactional lawyers spend a lot of time talking to clients, getting the facts that they need in order to turn the problem into the right legal framework and to, for example, write a contract that represents what their client wants. And this is, in effect, a kind of translation that begins with that interview. So that interviewing is something that every lawyer does a lot more than you might expect. So if we do not have our sole proprietorship and instead we have our limited liability entity, we are protected. And this is one reason that Maurice Wormser, at least, described the limited liability corporation as a single greatest discovery of modern times. But it is not a discovery, actually. I think of discovery as things that we find in nature, for example, and there's nothing natural about limited liability. Limited liability might be the greatest invention of modern times. And let's think about why Mr. Wormser might have thought of it that way. Well, one reason is that recall that if we have a sole proprietorship, the trade creditor will be able to go after Chancey's house. The problem here is that Chancey is not going to be willing to take the same degree of risk if all of Chancey's assets are at risk with respect to every business for which he's provided the capital and that he is running. So if we think about what that difference might be if you could protect his personal assets, let's look at as crude a depiction of the economic growth of civilization over the last 50,000 years. So we'll start with 1% to 1,000%. And across a 50,000 year period, let's track the economic growth strictly in material terms, although you could probably also draw a similar line from the one you're about to see in terms of expected life expectancy. So over almost all that 50,000 year period, you saw virtually no annual growth. And then suddenly, within just the last 200 years or so, you saw an extraordinary level of growth, and many attribute a substantial part of this to limited liability. And you can understand why, for example, in the 18th century, every company would have been John Adams and Sons, and at that time it would have been only Sons. And the reason is that John Adams is only going to trust his sons because all of their actions could result in personal liability on his part. And you're going to have businesses that are conducted only among people who have a high degree of trust and can easily monitor each other. But if you have limited liability, now you can invest in hundreds of businesses, each of which can have millions of shareholders, and no one needs to worry about anything more than the amount that they invest being at risk of loss. So what essentially limited liability allows is for the massive aggregation of capital. And that aggregation of capital is necessary for certainly some types of technological development or mass production. And that's one reason, along with the development of certain areas of law and technological development, that we might view limited liability as a major contributor to material growth over time. Now, this doesn't say anything about whether we've at the same time experienced a moral or philosophical or religious deficit over the last 50,000 years. We're speaking here strictly in a limited idea of economic growth. I also want to point out, though, at the other end of the spectrum here, if you were thinking about, so what's the big downside? And the one I would want to emphasize most is that Asymmetric liability is a way of thinking about limited liability in that you've got people who previously were responsible for the use of their capital. So if you were to start a business in the 18th century and it caused injuries, you would have been responsible for those injuries personally. What limited liability does is it says that the providers of capital are not personally responsible for the uses of their capital. Let's summarize what we've learned about limited liability. We know that if a business owner doesn't organize the business as a limited liability entity, which we'll learn more about later, then the business owner will be personally responsible for the obligations of the business. And what that means is the business owner's personal assets will be at risk. Limited liability protects the owner's personal assets, but keep in mind that it does not protect the assets of the business, which creditors with respect to the business can still claim.